Finally, after 2 years, basic astronaut training was over, and this was a big day of celebration for 14 people who are now best friends. 2 years, and now we kind of earned our wings, as we say, and we go on our different paths after that, each getting jobs in the astronaut office. Next slide, please. I was lucky to be assigned to a NEEMO mission, so an underwater simulation mission. This is an environment which is very close psychologically, again, to spaceflight. The same dangerous environment, the requirement for life support. Next slide, please. Confined spaces, a crew of 6 for 1 or 2 weeks. I had the chance to be there with our commander, Shannon Walker, who'd been experienced space farer, and Takuya Onishi, one of my classmates, and Professor Squires, a robotics fan will know because he's the man who put the rovers on Mars. Next slide, please. There's a mission control center, just like for a real space mission, with hundreds of people, scientists, engineers, controllers. So it is, in a sense, a real mission underwater. Next slide, please. Our mission was to simulate going to an asteroid, which is the next target for NASA. We were there to try methods that could be used to move around the asteroid. The challenge, of course, being that there's virtually no gravity there. So you can't land, you have to sort of dock. You can't walk, you have to maybe act similarly to a climber. Next slide, please. So we're trying various methods that engineers at NASA have been thinking about and giving reports to them. That way, when we do go to an asteroid, the techniques that are used will have been tried and tested. Next slide, please. Previous NEEMO missions by Canadians, there have been 3. And here we see Dr. Thirsk in an early NEEMO mission practicing some telemedicine and telerobotic surgery. And you can see on the bottom right, there's a consultant there guiding him and helping him out. That's our Dr. Anvari, who's been involved with this since the beginning. Next slide, please. So all this training will lead me one day to ride a Soyuz rocket. And I'm here calling you from Moscow because of some training I have to complete. Next slide, please. The Soyuz spacecraft is a very well-tried spacecraft, venerable spacecraft, we call it. Here I am with a colleague from the European Space Agency practicing in my pressure suit in an exact replica of the spacecraft that we saw in the video. Since the retirement of the space shuttles, this is, at the moment, the only ride to space. Everybody goes through that training. Next slide, please. This is a photo of the Soyuz spacecraft once it is docked to the International Space Station. I'm showing this to you to get you an idea of size. So you see the spacecraft and the 2 solar panels at the back of it. Next slide, please. This is the space station in orbit. In the center of the image, you can see the Soyuz spacecraft docked there. So that gives you an idea of the size of the space station. 100 meters span. It's orbiting at 400 kilometers overhead, going at 7 kilometers per second. That's 1 orbit every hour and a half. 16 sunrise and 16 sunsets every day. You can also see on the bottom of the space station there on this image, Canadarm, which is ready to either assemble a new module or perhaps help an astronaut do a spacewalk or perhaps help dock a resupply vehicle. Next slide, please. Canada, of course, played a very important role in the development of the International Space Station. It was built piece by piece using the Canadian robotic arm. Here we are, we see it holding one of the main truss members, a huge piece, the size of a bus. Next slide, please. This is the airlock, the door to the space station, also, of course, assembled using Canadian robotics. Next slide, please. And more recently, Canadarm again made the headlines. This is the Dragon spacecraft, the resupply cargo vehicle from commercial company SpaceX. The first time that a commercial spacecraft docks to the International Space Station, again using Canadian robotics. Next slide, please. The International Space Station is an international place, of course. In this photo, we have Canadians, Americans, Japanese, European, all united into this common living environment. Next slide, please. The International Space Station is mostly a research laboratory. Thousands of experiments going on at any given time. It is an orbiting laboratory where we can do research in the life sciences, material sciences, and also on the astronauts themselves to figure out the effect of prolonged microgravity on them. Next slide, please. One of the primary problems of long-duration space flight is the decay of bones and muscles. And in general, it seems to trigger kind of a accelerated aging. And of course, one of the main ways to stay fit in space is to do sports. Astronauts have to do about 2 hours of exercise every day. Here we see Julie Payette doing some stationary bicycling. Next slide, please. That's almost the end of our journey into space. This photo shows what looks like a shooting star. It's actually the fire streak of a spacecraft returning to Earth and this great blazing trail of fire as it enters the atmosphere at high speed. It has to slow down from 7 kilometers per second to a survivable velocity, you can imagine. Next slide, please. Finally, the Soyuz capsule lands with a parachute in the steppes of Kazakhstan. If everything goes normal, a couple of minutes later, the search and rescue teams are there to open the hatch and get the astronauts and cosmonauts out of there. Everybody says that once you believe you're going to be safe, it's actually quite a fun ride, but it can be a rocky ride. Next slide, please. The next Canadian to go into space is Commander Chris Hadfield. Chris will lead a space station expedition for 6 months. Launch is in December of this year, and I invite you to follow his adventures. For us, the Canadian space team, it's very important because it's the first time the Canadian will command a spacecraft. And we'll be very excited to see that happen. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I'd just like to leave you on maybe more poetic words. When astronauts go to orbit, all they do with their free time, of course, is go to the window and look outside, look back at our beautiful planet. Just like this photo I showed you initially of the Earth seen from the moon, nothing has changed. That remains the most interesting thing up there is the Earth. And I'd like to leave you with a little video made by space station crews from night shots of our planet. If you're a geography buff, you can probably recognize a couple of countries and cities. And you'll also see beautiful northern lights seen from above. Next slide, please.